So this is Joel Dining's third assignment for corporate social responsibility, our presentation slash TED Talks on the topics we chose to write papers about. So my paper was about SeaWorld and the response they had to a documentary called Blackfish that came out in 2013. Now, Blackfish was more or less a slant piece about a bunch of malpractices that SeaWorld was currently in the process of enforcing. So, why would you support a company that more or less had a bunch of malpractice going on? Well, because they hid it pretty well. So, like initially, even acquiring the whales for their captive whale shows, which was their main draw, SeaWorld's main draw was around their captive whale population and the shows they presented with them. They got those whales illegally. They went out and basically hunted them down in the wild, netted them, and then drug out the babies. And in the process, they ended up killing 2 whales in their nets. And, instead of maybe reporting it to the Wildlife Association or something like that, no, they decided to get a couple of their employees to cut open their carcasses, fill them with rocks, and throw them back in the water so they would sink and no one else would find them. Because what they were doing was illegal. Why would you support a company like this? So specifically, what really ended up helping out Blackfish was a media incident that happened between a whale Telecom and a trainer Dawn. This whale ended up killing her. And this was more or less the spark that we really needed to wake up the public to a bunch of the malpractice that was going on. So you could dive behind all the reasoning behind this about why the whales were doing all this kind of crazy stuff. So I'm going to put up a video here. This is actually one of their shows. I'm not sure from when, but I'll give you an idea of what we're talking about. So the incident with Dawn revolved around her and Telecom being out on a slide out, which has about a foot of water submerged on the platform. And the whale apparently gave no sign, according to SeaWorld, that they released in the public release statement, saying there was no sign that it was going to harm her in any way. Well, it did. It grabbed her by the arm and drug her underwater, and ended up killing her from drowning and blunt force trauma caused by her. So, after basically SeaWorld, in their public statement, denying any fault, a lawsuit was brought upon them. So the court was between the Florida SeaWorld and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And that ended up ruling that trainers and whales have to be separate during the shows. I'm not sure how well that can be enforced or to what measure they had to be separated, but that kind of put a wrench in the whole thing. So why are you going to support a company when their unique sales proposition of these whale shows are no longer as big as they were? But it continued into the fact that they started unveiling some of the background stuff. So they basically uninformed workers of the dangers of dealing with these animals and how dangerous, an apex predator in the ocean working in captivity can be, especially with all the mistreatment they underdo. But an example of just like poor business practices, it took them 30 minutes after Don's death to call the police. 30 minutes, basically finding a way to spin it so that they wouldn't come out the bad guys. It really didn't make any sense. Like, well, again, like we're supporting a company like this as the public, but so Don was one of their best trainers, and Telecom had been in performance use for 30 years. Now, that's very extensive, and Don was by far one of their best trainers. And let me put it this way, Telecom, at just 2 years old, was torn from his mother, and in the wild, this never happens. Even into adulthood, they stay with the same pod and with the same mother all the way through their lifespan, which is about 50 to 60 years in the wild. In captivity, it's about 10 to 13, which is a pretty crazy difference. But apparently, according to SeaWorld staff at some locations, they live longer in captivity. And that is just scientifically incorrect. So, and they also ended up training Tilcum with negative reinforcement. So that means he was punished, and they didn't just punish him when he didn't meet his expected standards. They punished the entire whale population, which actually caused inward fighting, and the whales would punish Tillicum himself when he didn't meet things along with the trainers. So that's quite a lot of punishment you're giving to someone that was torn from the parental figure at such a young age and is just bred to do whatever he's told. Especially when that animal is more powerful in his element than more or less anything else in the water. On top of that, they were stored in what a former SeaWorld employee described as just a floating steel box called a module. They were 20 feet by 30 feet deep. And they would keep a full-grown orca in these things. That is not enough space for an orca to stay. In SeaWorld, they would get about 10% of the swim activity they would in the wild, and that's lowballing it. Not to mention that they would more or less force the whales into these modules because that was the only place they would ever be given food. The food they were given was not good, so they were malnutritioned, as you can see by the collapsed dorsal fin that 90% of captive males have, and that that happens in less than 1% of wild whales, and it is a sign of an unhealthy whale in almost every regard. And on top of that, they were feeding them a chemical man-made gel for the purpose of altering their body appearance and keeping them hydrated. So they would adjust them to look more like what they properly should in the wild with this gel, but that was also how they hydrated them, because in the wild, they actually get their hydration from the prey that they kill. So like killing a leopard seal, which is like a 400-pound mammal, and more or less drinking its blood to stay hydrated. Instead, they would give it this chemical gel, which helped bulk up their appearance to like the more traditional appearance you'd see in the wild. So all this kind of combined in together to many biology experts coming to the fact, marine biology experts coming to the fact that these whales were developing psychosis because they are smart animals. They have the second largest brain to muscle mass of like any other animal. In fact, they've even developed a part of the brain that humans have not yet developed yet, which is for emotional intelligence, more or less. They can have a better understanding of emotions than humans do, which is kind of crazy. They even have their own languages and stuff like this. They are crazy smart, and yet we were sticking them in a pen and making them do tricks for our entertainment. So why are we supporting a company that does all this? I don't know, but we did. So SeaWorld's basically response to this film was deny it. It's a bunch of rubbish that doesn't actually exist, even though a lot of it can be proven. And there's other documentaries like Into the Tanks that prove almost the exact same thing about all this terrible practice that goes on to them. But the response also came too late, and people weren't having it because they knew it was not a good response. It was crap. So the damage to the public was already done. Their public perception was already done. So on March 2016, they announced that there'd be no more whale shows, and they'd be slowly retiring the whales and moving their whole corporate plan into a different avenue. And then additionally onto this, there was multiple legal acts put in place to stop this kind of practice with keeping killer whales in captivity. And it's not just an over and done issue, because you can't release these whales back into the ocean because they've grown up in small little boxes and have not grown up in the environment they'd have to adapt to. They have no skills they would need to find to just survive. Their bodies have been genetically and like chemically altered to be less stable and formidable than they would be in the wild. So they're slowly trying to retire all these whales, and then you have to find a way to slowly release them back into the wild or find a permanent place for them to stay, which is not very easy. Um, and like SeaWorld really could have stopped any involvement with this. Like, where was any corporate social responsibility in this? They literally just saw, oh, we can make money off of doing whale shows. So let's get these whales illegally, mistreat them for basically better use to us so we can control them more. And it ended up being that eventually when all this came to light, we weren't going to support this company anymore. We were just totally done with the idea that they were putting forward, and SeaWorld was forced to change into more of a theme park than a zoological enterprise, and slowly been fading out orca shows, and the financial fallout was absolutely insane from this as well. They went down 80% in the next quarter, in the quarter following all this public outlash. Their profits fell by 80% from the last quarter. That is an absolutely staggering figure. So yeah, it's more or less what I had to say about SeaWorld and why we shouldn't support companies that do this kind of stuff.